Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Around the World in 45 Minutes, Part 2, Global Perspectives on the Future of Work. I'm Musa Akel, Knotel's Director of Marketing, and I'll be moderating today's session. Thank you all for taking some time out of your day to join us. Hope you're all doing well and staying safe. I think you're going to find the information today quite interesting and enlightening. We're going to hear from another all-star lineup of some of our North American general managers as we get updates on some of the latest plans and thinking about returning to work here in the US. I'm going to do some quick housekeeping, and in a second I'll do introductions and introduce our GMs. We're going to cover today, over the course of the next 45 minutes, New York, San Francisco, LA, and Toronto. For those of you who joined us last week for part one, thanks for making it out. We had some of our European general managers on the line, hearing updates from Paris and London, Berlin, Amsterdam, Dublin. And, excited to hear today again from our North American GMs. These gentlemen are on the front lines working with customers and owners as we inch closer to getting returning to work. So again, thanks for taking some time to join us. We will carve out some time, as always, towards the end to do some live Q&A. I think we've got already a couple of those submitted. Make sure to submit those either through your Zoom interface or just go ahead and email them over at content@knotel.com. We'll be monitoring those throughout the session, and as appropriate, we'll pause the discussion today and try to work those in where we can. Again, we've got several hundred people signed up today, so thank you again for taking the time to join us. Everybody from heads of real estate to senior real estate executives to lots of HR folks, people ops, all clearly with a vested interest as they formulate their respective return to work plans with an emphasis on safety first and foremost and continuity. And so hopefully we'll be able to add some value to your day and share some lessons and insights and early best practices as our teams start to work on that material. And we're here live in New York, as you can probably hear from the background as well. And so excited again to hear from these execs. I'm Musa Akel, again, the Director of Marketing at Knotel. Today we've got with us Shagu Holder, the General Manager in New York, Shivam Patel, the GM who runs our East Coast expansion, and last but not least, Ari Kantrowitz, who is going to give us some updates from the West Coast, San Francisco and LA. Thank you all for taking some time to join us today. And before we loop the gentlemen in, let's we shared this last week, and I want to quickly share it again. Quite interesting. This is Knotel data, anonymized and aggregated, posted on our Spaces for Cities website. Interesting to look at how different markets and regions reacted to the coronavirus pandemic over the course of March and into April. This is, again, occupancy data. So think about this is essentially foot traffic to offices. And here on March 9th, we had LA at 100%, New York at 87%, and San Francisco, I think, got the earliest start, and we're going to hear why that was from Ari in a little bit. It was at 44%, and then again, LA jumping down to 65, New York, massive decrease you see here from 87 to 21, and then in San Francisco, we went from 44 to 14, and then by the week of March 23rd, most of the markets were near zero in occupancy. So we're going to try to focus, of course, the conversation today mostly on looking forward on what's next, but quite interesting to mine some of the data historically over the last month or so and try to understand if there's any lessons to be learned and insights to be gleaned. So without further ado, I want to introduce Shagu, who's going to talk for just a little bit. Obviously, lots going on in New York as kind of the epicenter of the pandemic. Many of you on the line are probably here still in New York. Hope you're staying safe. Many of us tune into the daily pressers from the Governor Cuomo, but there's lots to cover and nobody closer to the action than Shagu. So Shagu, I'm going to turn it over to you, and well, I guess we'll start here with some of the occupancy data and get your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Musa, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I think I don't think I've spoken to a lot of our partners recently in such a large forum, so I just wanted to say thank you for everyone, whether vendors, landlords, brokers, or customers who've worked with us during this pandemic. And obviously we'll be talking a lot and looking forward to speaking to you directly, and hopefully everyone is safe as we transition. Speaking about New York, I think if you look back at early March, March 7th, was a declaration of emergency. And then by March 12th, basically, most of the bars and restaurants were closed. Most of our spaces emptied out as a response. And Knotel focused at that time in basically securing spaces, making sure customers could transition to work from home in an efficient manner. And where we did have some customers who were deemed essential, supporting them in the process. And I think, turn to the next slide, Musa. I think when you put it in light with customer spending for New York, I think it does give a great sort of calibration. Most of March through mid-March, customer spending was relatively strong. And if you consider customer spending as a barometer for economic activity, I think you would see the city was healthy. But as the governor sort of put in place its orders and sort of ceased operations, you see a quick decline in activity. The blips you see are related to the release of the government stimulus. But what it did mean is that as we look at work from home, and we talk about it throughout my presentation, you see that activity is being down in the city, I think 37% year on year. So that gives a light in that as people transition to work from home, the overall activity is down. And so the ability to handle a lower activity load from home will be the challenge as we look to come back to work. Speaking about New York, New York is definitely being the hub for the coronavirus in the US, especially the tri-state region. 5% of the world's confirmed cases were here, so definitely epicenter. And if you sort of look at the tri-state, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, 33% of the cases, 50% of the related deaths. So, I mean, New York was definitely affected. It's too early to sort of make a prognosis on why, but I think there's clear evidence that density and mass transit definitely had an impact on the spread of the virus in the city. And put in context, New York with 28,000 residents per square mile is not double San Francisco, but significantly much more dense than the closest city, San Francisco. And then the second part of that, I think, is transportation. We're a city that depends on mass transit, whether it's the subways or the regional trains. And so 5 million people take the subways every day. If you add in the regional trains, it's a much higher number. And just for context, significantly more than any of the other major cities in the US. Maybe if you compare sort of global cities, you can find something that's similar. Both density and mass transit, we think, will affect create challenges as we go back to work. We don't have any clear answers, but we do expect government, private capital, and labor to basically spend some time trying to come up with solutions, infrastructure solutions, to allow us to transition back to work. But I think as our customers, as Knotel, as we contemplate return to work, I think we spend a lot of time thinking about the workspaces, but also New York is a dense environment and the transportation alternatives to allow people to commute into their workspaces. For New York, I think we've got clear guidance from the state that it won't be an immediate turn on in terms of a return to work. It's going to be a regional approach, and then further there'll be a phased rollout in the regions. On this slide, we focus on the 3 regions in New York that supply office workers to the city: Long Island, Mid-Hudson or Westchester County, and New York City. And as you can see, there are 7 criteria. Apologies for the size of the text, but none of the regions have met the requirements. New York has achieved 3 of the requirements. We've got a lot of work before we can sort of meet the trigger where we can start a phased rollout. As of today, we're on pause for all regions through May 15th. If we meet that requirement, then I think New York City or Westchester, Long Island could start opening up back. And then there'll be a phased rollout. And the phases, basically, construction is phase one. And again, the phases are dependent on meeting the requirements, but construction is expected potentially to start by May 15th, assuming we meet the requirements. And most of the office occupier population, including Knotel, we expect would be in phase two. And we don't have a clear guidance as of yet on when that will be, but clearly after May 15th would be estimate for today.
Yeah, this is interesting, Shagu. This is something we're hearing increasingly more often, this phased approach to reopening. This is something that the head of real estate at Uber was talking to us about in a session with our CEO, Amal Sarva, a couple weeks ago. I think his number was 20%. I've heard 25%, but I think kind of one of the universal themes of the reopen is that you're going to see occupancy quite down from what you would see normally, which might be 80%, 90% on a normal day, maybe a year ago. And so this phased approach, I think, is going to be in all of the markets. And interesting to see, Shagu, what that actual percentage is and how different companies approach that.
Correct. And I think just for complete context, there's going to be a phasing of regions, phasing of industries within the region. And I think where you're highlighting, Musa, is that companies will then, as they do the partial return, they will then phase their employees so as to maintain social distancing, focus on essential employees, and also to make sure that the transition is done in a way that it keeps them viable and working. And yeah, so I think the partial return will come after we sort of go through phase two. And at the end of the day, each business is going to have to make their own individual decision based on the efficiency they're seeing from work from home and other priorities. Knotel, of course, is here to participate in both the decision making and facilitate the actual direction and decision. I've listed here sort of New York State's requirements. I'm not going to go through each of them, but basically Knotel is going to partner with owners and customers to ensure that each of our workspace meets these requirements. We do expect a fair amount of customers, sophisticated customers, to want to implement even higher requirements, and we have the expertise and thought leadership to support those customers. And if things change, for example, if there's a second wave of coronavirus, our in-house experts can work with them to both facilitate the thought leadership, but also to help with the execution as we adapt our workspaces to the changing environment. I think the other thing that I wanted to highlight is while we have a fair amount of guidance on the phasing of the return to work and a fair amount of guidance on what a partial return will feel like, I think there is, we have to accept some level of uncertainty about the new normal. Our workforce has been working from home for 60 days plus, and I think that certain businesses have learned a lot about themselves due to reductions in workforce. The people coming back will be different, and not only in terms of numbers, but in terms of priorities and perspectives. And during the partial return, we're going to learn a lot also from these companies. Knotel itself will help our customers to judge the performance of their workspaces, and the new normal will emerge with that information. But I want to encourage our customers and the larger real estate participants to understand that the new normal is not going to be defined in terms of prescribed, but it's something that our customers will develop as they get information about their workspace performance, but also about their human capital and align it with their priorities. I guess I want to turn it over to Ari.
Yeah, Shagu, interesting there. Many of the regulars on the line know that Knotel has published some of our findings. We've done a couple of studies on work from home, one for our employees and a second one to more of the broader community as we start to aggregate some of the lessons. There's certainly lots to learn from what people are calling the great work from home experiment that we've been, I guess, going on for almost now 2 months. And so one of the things I think that's probably most likely to occur in the new normal. I'm using air quotes for new normal.
Correct.
Is the idea of a hybrid model. And while of course no one size will ever fit all, I think you're going to find a lot of companies much more comfortable with the hybrid approach, some blend of their workforce working from home much more than previously. Pre-coronavirus, the global work from home number across the entire workforce, I think globally, is 4%. People are estimating that could jump to almost 25% post-coronavirus. We don't know exactly what the number will be, but the one thing we know for sure is that it will be higher.
I agree. And I think there's been a lot of evidence to support that previously on-touch functions that had to operate in the office have performed from home. I think there's going to be willingness to experiment more. I do believe even in the partial return, there are going to be hindrances, whether it's childcare or transportation, as I highlighted in New York, that will limit the ability to transition back to the workspace, that will encourage this experiment to continue. And I do believe that the flexibility will lead to better productivity. I think the challenge as we look forward will be, obviously, as I talked about at the beginning, economic activity in New York is down. As we get back to a more stabilized world, I think we have to look at the performance in terms of the ability to work from home and meet that elevated economic activity. But I definitely expect, and we're seeing this from our customers already, that there'll be a hybrid model. And I do believe that people will be tweaking that model. So it's not going to be, here's the solution, the new normal. I think that information will change. And we've got a workplace strategy team and other expertise that will spend time with our customers to make sure we find the right answer so they can perform and the workspace is aligned with their priorities.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for that, Shagu. We'll probably pull you back in here in a little bit once we start getting questions. Before I turn it over to Ari, who's going to give us an update on the West Coast, both from San Francisco and Los Angeles. I think it's particularly for those following kind of the developments on the West Coast. Obviously, the governor there, Gavin Newsom, has been lauded for his leadership, not unlike Governor Cuomo here in New York. But Ari, one of the big storylines over there has been the decisive action from the mayors, both in LA and San Francisco, Eric Garcetti, London Breed, who started a little bit earlier. And as we saw those occupancy numbers, San Francisco and California on the aggregate did a little bit better. So I'm excited to hear from you, Ari, on what's going on over there. Tell us kind of the latest from the regulatory update, from the shelter in place. Then we'll talk a little bit about what you're hearing in conversations with customers and owners. And then, of course, I think maybe what most people on the line are interested in is share some of your thinking and your work on return to work plans.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Musa. Thank you, Shagu, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And I apologize in advance. You may hear some construction going on in the background, which is good news. So we're starting to resume construction in San Francisco as of this Monday. So excited about that. We're starting to come out a little bit. So I think, as you can see from this chart, San Francisco moved more quickly than did the general state of California and Los Angeles specifically. So we saw our occupancy numbers start to dip very, very quickly. We had clients go to full shelter-in-place mode even before the start of March. So one of the interesting things that we saw here was, while I think the government in California and then also the local governments as well moved more quickly than most of the rest of the country did, we saw private enterprise start to move well in advance of that. As early as February, on the VC side, you had VCs being very public about canceling meetings, having no handshake policies, for which they were initially lambasted, but obviously looks fairly prescient right now. So we started to see that also with larger enterprises outside of our portfolio start to move to at least a hybrid model of work from home, and then some just moving fully to a remote model. So I'd say the Bay Area in general moved very quickly. Looking at the data here, I think there's a clear divide between LA and San Francisco in that LA is much more closely following California state guidelines, whereas San Francisco is taking a bit of a more conservative approach. For example, construction in Los Angeles was actually considered essential throughout the shelter in place. So we had a number of projects ongoing. One of the things that we saw there, though, was due to shelter in place guidelines and due to social distancing requirements, project timelines got extended because you have to have fewer people in place. You can't have multiple trades on site at the same time. And as Shegu alluded to earlier, one of the biggest confounding factors here is the fact that schools and daycare is closed. So we have a lot of these frontline workers that are also caregivers, and they were unable to get on site on a regular basis. So I think that's going to be one of the continuing challenges for any sort of return to something resembling normalcy is getting schools and childcare reopened. But in general, I think this is going to continue to be a fairly dynamic environment where we have to navigate a fair amount of uncertainty. Absent really clear formal guidelines, we are advising our clients on best practices related to what we're seeing out of public health experts and just leveraging all of the expertise we have around workplace strategy. And our core focus is going to be on maximizing employee safety as well as comfort while ensuring that we can be as flexible as possible and be as proactive as possible as the environment continues to change. Can we move to the next slide? Thanks. So as I said, we moved fairly quickly in California. So the state, so Gavin Newsom has laid out a 4-stage approach. Stage 1 being, building out testing capacity, contact tracing, PPE, and hospital capacity. We are starting to feel comfortable about where we are there. So we are beginning to move to Stage 2. Stage 2 is the gradual opening of lower risk workplaces like retail, manufacturing, schools, which again are going to be very critical, and also offices. So very excited about that. So we're starting to see guidance that's going to have retail reopening by mid-month, probably just initially with curbside delivery. But again, that portends some more loosening and advancements throughout these stages. So we're starting to feel a lot better about actually getting back into offices. Stage 3 involves opening up higher risk workplaces, and that's going to be things that are very either high contact or have a large amount of people in the same place. So that's going to be salons, that's going to be gyms, that's going to be things like movie theaters. And then Stage 4 is covering large scale events, so concerts, sporting events, and things of that nature. And the guidance there has been like, don't expect anything potentially until 2021. And all of this, again, is going to be predicated upon maintaining that balance of Stage 1 of sufficient capacity. But again, this is going to be a new normal for a long time. There's no return to normal as we knew it until there's a sufficient level of immunity in the population and a vaccine. At least that's the guidance that we're getting from the government of California. Trying not to be an amateur epidemiologist here. So I think starting to see green shoots in terms of things reopening. So as I said, construction's allowed now again in San Francisco, both residentially, which is annoying me all day, and commercially, which means we're getting our projects back online in San Francisco, and hoping to continue pushing that forward and maintaining safe spaces. We're keeping in close contact with all of the landlords and owners that we work with, and trying to understand what their position is. And by and large, most of them are waiting for more formal guidance. We think at minimum, there's going to be mask requirements throughout all of their buildings. We are starting to see some of the more sophisticated and larger ownership groups be much more proactive and prescriptive with respect to their expectations for what return to work looks like. And that's going to be placement of wayfinding markers in common areas, putting informational signage at all entrances, covering COVID-19 expectations, face covering requirements, and basic social distancing guidelines, and then things like limiting elevator capacity. So not allowing more than 2 people in an elevator at the same time unless they're from the same family or sort of home unit. And then, just broader restrictions on common areas. There are still some key open questions with respect to infrastructure within those buildings. I'd say luckily in the West Coast, the vast majority of our portfolio is in Class A spaces with with fairly sophisticated HVAC infrastructure and things like that. I'll be curious to see what the impact is going to be on some of the older and less advanced buildings in the commercial portfolio.
Yep. Air filtration is a big deal with regards to, designing safe offices. Ari, Amal's, our CEO, talks about that quite a bit in terms of kind of the building health in New York. So interesting to see how that the HVAC and the air filtration systems will evolve and how long that'll take as companies start to, invest in building kind of the new safe workspace.
Yeah, again, it's the notion of what the antiviral office will ultimately look like, and obviously sophisticated HVAC filtration systems are going to be a key component of that. Moving on. So yeah, customer concerns. Our customers' primary concerns right now, and again, glad to have a lot of operations people on the line, is essentially employee safety followed by employee comfort. So it's really focusing on two things. One is us providing advice on guidelines to actually maximize safety according to best practices of CDC and similar organizations. But in addition to actually implementing safe practices, it's also really important that we make employees feel safe. So when they do come back to the office, they're not constantly concerned about their safety. They're able to to return to work in as normal capacity as possible. So that's going to be things like in addition to doing the things that actually follow those guidelines, it's going to increase the visibility of it. So making sure that employees actually see all of the signage, see cleanings happening, so that they can fully understand that the safety of their space is being maximized. Otherwise, it's more of the strategic element of helping teams manage that transition from shelter in place back to the office, and really managing the change. So again, we're not going to have a business as usual for quite some time. So it's helping our customers implement strategy around working groups. So A/B teams, again, it's really going to be that hybrid approach that's going to be driven by who's an essential employee that needs to be in the office, who can work from home, but also making sure that we're able to follow social distancing guidelines in the physical space. And that's going to be an important element of the hybrid model as well. How are we facing the design challenges to facilitate distancing? I'll get a little more specific on that. And then, figuring out, great, we have all of these common rooms like kitchens, conference rooms, soft seating areas. Those are things that are potentially off limits as currently used. So how are we going to help repurpose that to make sure that we're maximizing efficiency within an office? Next slide.
Yeah, Ari, this is interesting as you talk about customer concerns. We have a question from Alex that I think is probably good to take now. The Barclays CEO doesn't think we should have large downtown HQs anymore. What are your thoughts about that perspective? So I think he's referring to I've seen the headline. He says something like it's not likely that we can fit 7,000 people in a large HQ. And then we've got I think the Morgan Stanley CEO talking about it's very likely we're going to have a smaller footprint. What are you hearing? And Shagu, interested on your perspective as well. Are you guys hearing anything about smaller, bigger corporate footprints with regards to office, or is it still too early right now to tell?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, most of the customers that we interact with, we don't supply headquarters for them on that scale. We do expect to see an increase in distributed offices. So instead of, one singular location that can support up to 10,000 employees, like a campus style approach, I do expect to see more distributed offices, either throughout a city or a metropolitan area.
I would say the same. I think it's driven by the risk management, as Ari highlighted. I think it's also driven by the fact that a workforce can work effectively from home wherever, or at least in a lot of different places. And so I think there's going to be a dispersion either throughout cities or throughout the country. We directly haven't seen it in our portfolio, but we've had a lot of people sort of talking about that as one of their potential strategies as they return to work.
Interesting. I've heard a little bit more again on this trend, potentially of decentralization as you think about location. Speaking of that, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our CEO Amal will be actually talking to the head of real estate at Dropbox this Friday, precisely about site selection, right? As we get to hear from kind of a head of real estate about how they think now about picking locations. And the strategic importance of different geographic regions and the debate of like central business districts versus maybe a little bit more suburban. So excited to hear from her and Amal this Friday about site selection. Let's continue. Ari, how are we advising our customers?
Yeah, so we're focused on sort of the temporal elements of what we have to deal with, so that taking a now, soon, later approach with them. So, and I'll dive a little bit more into detail on how we're handling the now, because that's where we are. So now is focused on minimizing the immediate impact to workspaces, focused on that safety and sanitation, reducing density, and making sure employees are educated on behavioral changes, again, through working with our customers' workplace teams, but also through a lot of informational signage, wayfinding, and things like that. What we're starting to engage in now is thinking about, okay, what physical workspace changes, inclusive of furniture and infrastructure solutions, do we need to put in place in the midterm? So that's like, what does the new physical office look like? How are we going to be really physically repurposing common areas? Are common areas even going to be a thing in the near future? So taking that approach. And then later, again, it's like, what does a new normal under these conditions ultimately look like? So how can we effectively plan for reduced density in a cost-effective way for our customers? Really looking at material science that we can deploy antimicrobial surfaces that require much less cleaning, that are stain resistant, and so on. So it's going to be a fundamental change to how we approach the physical office. So we want to jump to the next slide. So again, the focus on now, and this is just going to be reiterating some of the things that I mentioned before, but really getting into the brass tacks of how we can make a current office without doing major construction or furniture reconfiguration effective in this environment and safe in this environment. So it's adding sanitizing stations and products at entry and exit. It's moving desks away from wet sinks. It's figuring out ways to allocate workstations within the current space. It's really adding that wayfinding and signage to enforce physical distancing and consistently remind employees, putting directional corridors in hallways, reducing occupancy in meeting rooms. So it's going to be things like, converting smaller conference rooms potentially into individual offices or phone rooms, larger conference rooms, really reducing capacity and being strict about signage and enforcement, and really just a different approach to density. So again, it's that alternate workstation capacity. It's advising on what AB, even ABC teams look like, and really it's looking like right now it's going to be a 50% reduction in occupancy in current spaces based on the density requirements that we have in California to actually achieve that 6-foot distancing.
Interesting, 50%. Okay, we'll see how that plays out. Ari, thank you for that excellent update, and we appreciate that. We will again, we'll probably loop you back in here in a couple minutes as we take questions. We've got 12 minutes left. Again, if you have questions, send them to content@knotel.com. We will be happy to take those. Last but not least, we're going to get an update. We'll go away from the governors for a second and bring in Shivam, who will give us an update on what's happening in Toronto and the update from the Prime Minister over there. Shivam, thanks for joining us. What's the latest?
Yeah. So hey everyone. Appreciate everyone jumping on. Just for some context, the Canadian provinces, much like many U.S. states, had been taking a phased approach to the lockdown starting in mid-March. The province of Ontario started limiting kind of public gatherings and gradually started shutting down bars, restaurants, and schools and theaters, and finally stopped all non-essential business on March 24th. There's expected to be guidance coming out later today about likely an extension of the lockdown for the next 2 weeks. But that being said, the government has actually started to loosening up restrictions this past Monday. So with industries much like San Francisco, construction is opening back up, landscaping is opening back up. And the government's also providing kind of sector-specific guidelines onto how to safely reopen things like retail shops and even commercial offices. This will be like many states in the U.S. This is going to be a phased approach based on kind of essential need, but the data and messaging from the government is rather encouraging. And interestingly enough, Toronto is the fourth largest city in North America. And I think when you compare it to other cities like New York, Boston, or even Detroit, they haven't been impacted nearly as badly as other cities. I do think there's probably two main reasons for this. Number one, COVID-19 actually isn't Canada's first major coronavirus outbreak. If you recall, the country, and in particular Toronto, was hit really bad by SARS back in 2003. And I think the government this time around appears to have taken a more swift and coordinated response to the virus, and I think has greatly kind of benefited from an increased amount of testing and tracing. The second reason I think Canada, and specifically Toronto, has been doing quite well with the virus. And this is just a disclaimer on this point. I'm not an epidemiologist or pretend to be an amateur epidemiologist, but this is an assumption that a lot of experts in Canada are making, is that actually closing the U.S. border in kind of mid-March really helps reduce the spread. As we learn about where the virus is kind of spreading from to Canada, it looks like many cases actually came from people traveling to and from the U.S., much like many cases seem to be coming into New York through Europe. And so I think just kind of given the current situation, I am personally kind of cautiously optimistic that Toronto is going to be reopening sooner rather than later compared to many other North American cities. So what does this mean for our customers and kind of what Knotel's doing? So after speaking to a lot of different customers and ranging from kind of startups to large enterprises, it seems like there's really kind of two main approaches that customers are taking right now. While none of our customers are intending to head back to the office in May, irrespective of when the lockdown is lifted, some customers who have kind of historically taken a wait and see approach are now kind of definitively saying they will continue to work from home. I've heard companies extending their work from home timelines through August or through October. This doesn't mean that they may not take a hybrid approach later on, but I am seeing companies saying, if you want to stay at home, you can stay at home for at least through the end of the summer. And these return dates don't seem really based on Toronto specific guidelines, but more just kind of global mandates across a company's entire office portfolio. On the other hand, we are seeing companies that are deferring to local cities and guidelines and dictating kind of how and when their office reopens. As Ari kind of mentioned, this is going to be a phased approach. It's going to be a small percentage of essential workers, call it anywhere from 1 to 25%. Maybe it's teams alternating days, maybe they're alternating work hours, but it's certainly not going to be at the capacity density that we've seen previously. And so while we haven't been kind of prescriptive in telling customers whether they should continue to work from home or phase back in, we do want to ensure that all our members are adhering to any federal, state, and local guidelines, as well as trying to help companies implement any company level guidelines that they may be looking to implement in other offices outside of the Knotel portfolio. And so, at a minimum, we're working with customers to kind of get all information that's required. And if they do decide to go back to work, help them be in a position to do it successfully. And I just want to kind of underscore what Ari and Shagun had touched upon, but I think this is extremely important in terms of being able to have adaptability and flexibility into your reopening plan. And everyone is kind of developing a plan or starting to think about it, but it does need to change and it does need to flex accordingly. I think there does need to be flexibility in terms of having a hybrid work from home model as well as working on site. And inevitably, as Ari kind of mentioned, there's going to be a requirement to have flexibility in terms of redesigning your office and how exactly are you maintaining social distance and flow of the space. That may mean alternating desks to people sitting in every other desk. That may mean removing or spacing out lounge furniture, as well as adding additional signage about capacity and kind of putting restrictions on certain rooms or areas where once maybe it was 10 people for a specific zone and setting, now maybe it's more like 4 or 5. So, I just think given flexibility is one of Knotel's core value propositions, we've certainly been helping clients kind of think through best practices and trying to provide guidance. Our interior designers and workplace strategists have already come up with redesign plans and layouts to optimize distance for some of our members. And I expect as we get closer to reopening, more customers will kind of inquire about this specifically. Finally, I just wanted to touch upon a couple of trends that we're seeing in Toronto. First, I think there's going to be many more subleases hitting the market very soon. That's just the reality of, I think, the economic hardships that many companies are facing. That being said, Toronto, as some of you might know, is a very, very tight commercial real estate market, around 2% vacancy. So there's a potential for an additional maybe 50 basis points to 1% of vacancy coming online via the sublease market and provide more inventory to the city. The last thing that we're noticing from an Knotel perspective is really that the number of inquiries is starting to pick back up, which I think is a great leading indicator. Over the past week and a half, we've had about 6 new leads, all kind of requesting something around a September move-in. And we certainly expect those number of inquiries to continue to trend upwards as we gradually open up the market more and more.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Shivam. Let's 4 minutes left. I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. Again, we're doing quite a bit of work on returning to work. If you're a customer, you've probably been in touch with our customer teams. If you are interested in seeing some of the material we're working on and getting a sneak peek, if you're not a customer, definitely reach out, email content@knotel.com for questions. We're working, again, with leading health experts, workplace strategists to figure out what the right answer is for new look and feel of offices when we return. Let's take some questions. We'll do rapid fire because I'm eager to hear from you gentlemen. Let's do the first question. This is from David, and I think, Shivam, this actually segues quite well into what you were talking about. You mentioned flexibility there a couple times towards the end, and then you talked about new leads starting to trickle in. The question from David is, do you anticipate a shift in the types of businesses or industries who are taking advantage of flexible office? So now, obviously, post-pandemic, the notion of a 10 or 15-year lease looks much less attractive. What are you all seeing, Ari, Shigu, Shivam, in terms of new interest from maybe companies or industries we haven't particularly seen? And how do you expect that to change over the next 6, 12, 18 months?
Yeah, so I'd say haven't really seen a dramatic shift in terms of the types of customers that we're engaging with. I'd say, the companies that are moving still more proactively right now are the larger enterprises that have longer planning cycles and I think more certainty. But fundamentally, we haven't seen a dramatic shift in the types of companies that have been putting inquiries in.
Shigu or Shivam, if none of you want to chime in on that.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that everyone, I think, is just given the macro environment is starting to think more about flexibility. Well, I agree with Ari. I've not seen a trend towards maybe more professional services companies or companies that historically have not been a part of the platform, at least in my markets that I cover. I do think more and more people are starting to talk about flexibility, and I think no one wants to make a long-term bet right now, given the macro environment. I think the opportunity to do a shorter-term flexible deal with Knotel is just going to become more and more attractive.
Great. Let's do a couple more if we can. What about we've got a lot of questions. We just got one from Amy about phone booths. Knotel, obviously, we've got geometry phone booths in our office, a great way to boost productivity, kind of single workstations. What are your thoughts, gentlemen, on what the phone booth will look like, or if it'll be different, or how we're going to think about phone booths in workspaces after this?
I'll jump in. Ari or Shivam, if you want to jump in also, feel free. I think our commitment in now is to make sure we keep it a very hygienic environment, both in terms of keeping sort of cleaners in the space, but also regular cleanings in the space. We're looking at our own geometry design and figuring out ways to improve the performance of the phone booths. And we're encouraging customers that are not comfortable to transition either small offices into a replacement for a phone booth. But I think there's more to come on this topic. I don't know if Ari or Shivam, you want to add more there?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think it's, a lot of it's going to come down to individual company preferences right now. And again, making sure we're maximizing the hygienic nature of those environments. And if they require, if we have a customer that has an intense use of phone booths, ensuring that we're getting the right amount of cleaning in there, right? Some of it may come down to contact tracing as well. So again, I expect that to be dynamic in development.
Great. Right at 1:45, as promised, around the world in 45 minutes. Huge thank you to Shigu, Shivam, and Ari for taking some time out of their busy days to join us and give us updates on their respective markets. Hope you found the session helpful. If you were interested in listening to part 1 and missed that last week, again, Berlin, Dublin, Amsterdam, London, and Paris, there's the link there. Questions about Workspace and locations and general inquiries, definitely reach out, growth at Knotel. Content questions, if you're interested in seeing some of our latest research, thinking, work from home white paper, poke around on the website, get in touch with us. And then again, this Friday, Naseem Yalpani, head of real estate and Workspace at Dropbox, will be our special guest, 1 p.m. Eastern, on a line with our CEO, Amal Sarva. Hope you can join us for that. Again, thanks again for everyone taking time to join us. Hope you found the session helpful. Stay safe and see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Musa.
Thank you.